The silver picture frames from our wedding were still sitting on the wooden table in the main hallway. The glass was so clean it shined under the soft yellow lights of the ceiling. If you walked past the big front windows of this beautiful house from the outside, you would think everything was perfect. Miles Sterling, a successful young businessman from a good family, had just married Hazel Vance. It was the exact kind of elegant, quiet wedding that everyone in our town talked about for weeks. Our families smiled, our friends took hundreds of photos, and everyone thought we were the happiest new couple in the world. They believed we were starting a beautiful, long life together in this big, quiet suburban home. But inside the house, the reality was completely different. The silence here didn't feel peaceful at all. It felt heavy and scary, like the cold air right before a terrible winter storm hits the coast. I stood near the kitchen counter early in the morning, my hands wrapped around a white mug of black coffee. The coffee had already gone completely cold, but I didn't even care to reheat it. Across the kitchen, Miles was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his expensive leather watch and fixing his gray tie. His movements were sharp, quick, and very deliberate. He did not look at me. In fact, he had not looked directly into my eyes a single time since we left the wedding reception 3 days ago. During the 6 months when we were dating, he was the most charming, attentive, and kind man I had ever met. He used to bring me flowers, ask about my day, and listen to me talk for hours. But the moment the wedding rings went on our fingers, all of that warmth disappeared. Now he acted like I was just a ghost living in his space. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't sound like a new husband talking to his wife. It sounded like a cold businessman talking to a stranger. "Your mother called my office this morning," Miles said, his eyes still fixed on the neat alignment of his shirt cuffs. He didn't even turn his head toward me. "She wants to know if we are hosting the big Thanksgiving dinner at our place next month. I told her we would make a final decision later, specifically when Stella comes home from college for her semester break." The moment he said my younger sister's name, Stella, something shifted in the room. His voice wasn't freezing cold anymore. For a fraction of a second, his tone became soft, almost gentle. I watched him closely in the mirror, and my stomach instantly twisted into a tight, painful knot. I knew my sister Stella was beautiful, full of life, and everyone loved her. But why did my new husband's voice change like that just by saying her name? A dark, heavy feeling settled deep in my chest. There was a terrible secret hiding beneath the surface of my new marriage. Miles picked up his black leather briefcase from the chair, walked straight out the front door, and drove away without saying a single goodbye. The big house felt even colder than before, and a small voice inside my head told me that my new life was about to become a living nightmare. The rest of the day passed in a slow, suffocating blur. Miles did not call or text me from his office, which was no longer a surprise. To keep my mind from spinning with anxious thoughts about his cold behavior, I spent the afternoon cleaning the already spotless house. I wiped down the marble countertops, arranged the books on the living room shelves by color, and made sure every single cushion on the large velvet sofa was perfectly straight. I was trying so hard to be the ideal wife, to build a warm home out of a cold house, even though the man who owned it treated me like a complete stranger. By late afternoon, the front doorbell rang, breaking the heavy silence. When I opened it, I found Miles's parents, Arthur and Elara Sterling, standing on the porch. Elara was dressed in a pristine wool coat, holding a small basket of fresh pastries from the town's best bakery. Her face lit up with a warm, genuine smile the moment she saw me. Unlike Miles, his parents genuinely loved my quiet nature. They had always praised my modesty, my cooking skills, and how responsible I was. "Hazel, dear, you look absolutely lovely," Elara said as she stepped into the warm hallway, handing me the basket. She walked into the living room and looked around, nodding with deep approval. "Look at this place, Arthur. It's so clean and peaceful. I knew Hazel would make a wonderful wife for our Miles. She knows exactly how to manage a proper household." Arthur smiled and nodded, settling into one of the armchairs. "We are very proud to have you in the family, Hazel. Miles is a busy man, but we know he is in good hands with you." I smiled back at them, but my heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. I felt like an actress playing a role in a fake movie. They had no idea that their perfect son hadn't spoken more than 5 sentences to me in 3 days. They didn't know that the beautiful bedroom upstairs was divided by an invisible wall of ice. I went to the kitchen and quickly prepared a fresh pot of herbal tea, serving it alongside the pastries on a polished silver tray. As we sat together, Elara talked about the upcoming winter charity gala and how she wanted me to stand by her side as her daughter-in-law. "You have such a calming presence, Hazel," Elara said softly, patting my hand. "Miles can be stubborn and overly ambitious sometimes, but your gentle spirit is exactly what he needs to stay grounded." I forced myself to nod and thank her, swallowing the lump of tears forming in my throat. They saw my silence as a sign of being a traditional, good wife. They didn't realize it was actually the silence of a girl who was losing herself. Just as Elara was asking about our holiday plans, the front door clicked open. Miles walked into the house, his coat slightly damp from the evening mist. The moment he saw his parents sitting with me, a practiced, charming smile immediately flashed across his handsome face. He walked over, kissed his mother on the cheek, and shook his father's hand with perfect respect. "Mom, Dad, what a pleasant surprise," Miles said, his voice dripping with warmth. Then he turned to me, his eyes bright with a fake affection that made my skin crawl. He gently placed his hand on my shoulder, looking directly at his parents. "Hazel is taking such good care of me. I am truly the luckiest man alive." The touch of his hand felt like ice on my bare skin. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. He was acting so perfectly in front of them, playing the role of the deeply in love, grateful husband. But as his fingers tightened just a little too hard on my shoulder, sending a warning signal straight to my heart, I realized something terrifying. Miles didn't just want to keep a secret. He wanted to make sure I was too trapped by his family's expectations to ever speak the truth. The weekend came quickly, and with it came a nervous energy that filled the entire house. It was the day my younger sister, Stella, was coming over for dinner. She had just returned from her college campus for a short semester break, and my mother had insisted she visit us first. Since early morning, Miles had been acting completely different. For the past week, he had barely noticed anything I did. But today, he was checking every single detail. He walked around the dining room, adjusting the expensive wine glasses, checking the freshness of the flowers I had placed in the vase, and even telling the housemaid to make sure the front porch was swept twice. He was full of energy, a sharp contrast to the cold, distant statue he usually was around me. "Are you sure you made the lasagna the way Stella likes it?" Miles asked, suddenly walking into the kitchen while I was chopping vegetables. I paused, the metal knife hovering over the cutting board. It was the first time in days he had looked directly at my face, yet he wasn't really seeing me. He was only thinking about the guest. "Yes, Miles, I made it with the extra cheese, just like she always prefers," I replied, keeping my voice as calm and soft as possible. He nodded quickly, checked his gold watch, and walked back toward the living room windows to wait. My hands started to shake slightly as I went back to chopping. A strange, heavy feeling was growing inside my stomach. Why did my husband care so much about how my sister liked her food? Why was he so restless? At exactly 7 o'clock, the sound of a car horn echoed from the driveway. Miles didn't even wait for the maid to go to the door. He walked straight to the entrance himself and pulled it open. A second later, the quiet house was filled with a bright, loud laugh. It was Stella. "Hazel, oh my gosh, this place is absolutely huge." Stella squealed as she ran past Miles and threw her arms tightly around my neck. She smelled like expensive floral perfume and fresh winter air. Stella was 20, 2 years younger than me, and she was the kind of girl who lit up any room she walked into. She had long, shiny blonde hair, big bright eyes, and a confident smile that made everyone instantly fall in love with her. She was everything I wasn't: vibrant, loud, and effortlessly beautiful. "It is so good to see you, Stella," I whispered, holding her tightly. She felt like home, a safe piece of my old life before I moved into this cold mansion. As we walked into the living room, Miles stepped forward. The coldness in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a strange, intense light that made my heart drop. He took Stella's small coat from her hands with extreme politeness. "Welcome to our home, Stella," Miles said. His voice was lower now, incredibly smooth and softer than I had ever heard it before. "We have been waiting for you all day. You look absolutely stunning. College life clearly suits you well." Stella laughed, blushing a little at the compliment, completely unaware of the darkness hiding behind his handsome smile. Thanks, Miles. You're not doing too bad yourself. Marriage looks good on you guys. We all sat down at the dinner table, but as the night went on, I felt more and more like a stranger in my own home. Miles completely ignored me, but it wasn't the cold neglect from before. It was a focused, deliberate choice. Every time Stella spoke about her college classes, her friends, or her trips, Miles listened with absolute fascination. He laughed at every joke she made, poured her drink before she could even ask, and kept asking her questions to keep her talking. You always had the best taste in everything, Stella, Miles said gently. His eyes locked onto her face as she talked about an art gallery she visited. I always admired that about you. I sat right beside him, completely silent, watching his eyes. He wasn't looking at her the way a brother-in-law looks at a sister. He was looking at her with a deep, hungry longing. It was a tiny, subtle shift in his expressions, the way his eyes stayed on her lips a second too long, the way his body leaned toward hers across the table. My hand gripped my fork so tightly my knuckles turned white. A terrifying truth was starting to take shape in the darkness of my mind, and the lasagna in my mouth tasted like ashes. The clock on the living room wall struck 11 when Stella finally left. Miles stood at the door for a long time, watching her red car drive down the street until the taillights completely disappeared into the dark night. The moment he closed the heavy oak door, the warm, charming husband vanished. The air in the house instantly turned freezing cold again. He didn't say a word to me. He just turned around, loosened his tie with a sharp jerk, and walked straight up the stairs to our bedroom. My heart was beating fast, heavy with an anxiety I could no longer control. I cleaned up the remaining plates from the dining table, my hands trembling so much that the porcelain rattled against the wood. I couldn't keep living in this quiet confusion anymore. I needed to know the truth. I needed to look my husband in the eye and ask him why he was treating me like a piece of unwanted furniture. Slowly, I walked up the stairs. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight coming through the windows. I reached our bedroom door, took a deep breath to steady my shaking voice, and gently pushed it open. Miles was standing by the large glass window, his back to me. He had already taken off his jacket and shirt, wearing only his dark trousers. He didn't turn around when he heard the door open, but his shoulders went stiff. Miles, I spoke softly, my voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. Can we please talk? It has been a week since our wedding, and you barely speak to me. Did I do something wrong? If there is something bothering you, please just tell me. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the wind brushing against the glass pane. Then, slowly, Miles turned around. The expression on his face made my breath catch in my throat. There was no warmth, no kindness, not even the polite distance he showed in front of his parents. His eyes were dark, filled with a deep, burning resentment. Get out, he said. His voice wasn't loud or angry. It was incredibly low, calm, and sharp as a razor blade. I froze, staring at him in shock. What? Miles walked over to me, his steps slow and deliberate. With every step he took toward me, I felt the air leaving my lungs. He stopped just inches away from my face. The handsome features that I had fallen in love with during our summer dates now looked completely alien, twisted into a mask of pure disgust. I said, "Get out of this room, Hazel," he repeated, his words dripping with venom. Before I could even react, his hand gripped my upper arm firmly. He didn't slam me, but the force of his grip was unyielding as he pulled me toward the door. Look at yourself. You are so plain, so boring, so completely dull. You honestly thought a man like me could actually love someone like you? Miles, please, you're hurting me, I whispered, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. He pushed me out into the dark, cold hallway, letting go of my arm so suddenly that I stumbled back against the opposite wall. He stood in the doorway, looking down at me as if I were dirt under his expensive shoes. Let's clear things up right now so we don't have to repeat this drama again, Miles said, his face completely emotionless. I never wanted you. The only reason I put a ring on your finger is because your sister Stella is the one I actually want. You are just a plain, ugly shadow compared to her. I only married you to stay close to her, to have a permanent excuse to be in her life. Now, take your things and sleep in the guest room. I don't want to see your face for the rest of the night. Before I could even find my voice to speak, the heavy bedroom door slammed shut right in front of my face. The sharp sound echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot, leaving me completely alone in the freezing dark. The wood of the hallway floor felt like blocks of ice against my bare skin. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I just leaned my back against the wall opposite our bedroom door and slowly slid down until my knees touched my chest. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to tuck them under my arms just to keep them still. The heavy silence of the house settled over me again, but this time, it felt like a heavy weight crushing my chest. Every single word Miles had just said kept repeating in my head like a cruel loop. I never wanted you. You are just a plain, ugly shadow compared to her. I only married you to stay close to her. A few tears escaped my eyes, hot and fast, tracing paths down my cold cheeks. But there was no loud sobbing. There was no screaming, no running to the door, no breaking of the beautiful silver picture frames downstairs. The shock was too deep for that. It felt as if Miles had quietly reached inside my chest and turned off my ability to breathe. I looked down at the gold wedding band on my left ring finger. It looked heavy, like a tiny handcuff holding me to a life that was already dead. The hours crawled by in the darkness. Every small sound in the empty house magnified. The ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs sounded like a countdown. The wind rattling the high windows felt like it was mocking me. I stared at the closed bedroom door, waiting, perhaps foolishly, for it to open. Part of my brain, the desperate, terrified part, wanted him to come out, laugh, and tell me it was just a sick, horrible joke. I wanted him to be the gentle man who had held my hand at the botanical gardens 3 months ago. But deep down, in the quietest part of my soul, I knew the truth. That man never existed. It was all a carefully planned lie. He had looked at my family, seen my beautiful, lively sister, and decided that marrying the quiet, responsible older sister was his golden ticket into her world. He knew my parents would trust him. He knew his own parents would approve of a quiet girl like me, and he knew he could hide his sick obsession under the cover of being a perfect brother-in-law. By 3 in the morning, the hallway grew even darker as the moon disappeared behind thick winter clouds. My body was completely numb from the cold drafts blowing through the old corridors. I slowly stood up, using the wall to balance my trembling legs. I didn't open the door to the guest bedroom. Instead, I walked down the long hallway toward the small linen closet at the very end. I pulled out a single, thin woolen blanket, wrapped it tightly around my shoulders, and sat back down on the hard floor right there in the dark corner. I didn't sleep for a single second. I just watched the shadows shift across the ceiling, feeling the absolute weight of my isolation. I was trapped in a beautiful, expensive prison, and the man who held the key had just told me I was nothing but a shadow. But as the very first light of dawn began to turn the dark hallway into a pale, dusty gray, something inside me stopped crying. The deep, heavy sadness didn't disappear, but it began to freeze into something solid. A quiet, cold stillness took its place. He had broken my heart, but as I sat alone on that freezing floor, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let him break my life. The next morning, the sun didn't burst through the clouds with a warm, comforting light. Instead, it slowly bled into the sky, a pale and watery gray that cast long, thin shadows across the cold guest bedroom floor. My eyes burned from the total lack of sleep, the skin around them feeling tight and dry. I had spent the last 4 hours of the night sitting in the absolute stillness of that corner, listening to the house slowly wake up. Downstairs, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of the housemaid moving about, the soft rustle of her broom, the distant click of plates being neatly stacked in the kitchen. The normal, everyday routine of the world was moving forward, completely unaware that my entire life had just been shattered into a million sharp, painful pieces. I stood up from the hard floor, my muscles aching with a deep physical exhaustion. As I walked over to the small mirror hanging on the guest room wall, I forced myself to look at my reflection. Miles's harsh, venomous words from last night immediately started playing in my head again. You are so plain, so boring, so completely dull. I looked at my pale skin, my dark hair tangled around my shoulders, and the deep purple shadows bruising the skin beneath my eyes. For a fraction of a second, a dangerous, heavy wave of self-doubt washed over me. Was he right? Was I really just a boring, invisible shadow compared to my bright, beautiful sister? No, I whispered aloud into the empty, quiet room, my voice sounding small but firm. I gripped the edges of the wooden dresser until my fingertips turned white. He wants you to feel small. You must stay strong just to survive this. I changed into a simple sweater, pulling my hair back into a neat bun. If Miles wanted me to play the role of the quiet, obedient wife in front of the world, I would play it, but only to protect myself and buy enough time to figure out my next step. When I slowly walked down the grand wooden staircase, the heavy scent of fresh coffee and expensive buttered toast filled the air. Miles was already sitting at the head of the long dining table, dressed in a flawless dark blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the successful, handsome businessman. He was calmly reading a financial newspaper, taking occasional sips from his porcelain cup. Looking at him, you would never guess that just a few hours ago, he had cruelly dragged his new wife out of his room and thrown her into the dark. He looked completely untroubled, as if last night had been nothing more than a minor, insignificant business transaction. As my shoes clicked softly against the polished marble floor, Miles didn't even look up from his paper. The air between us instantly turned to absolute ice. "Your breakfast is getting cold," Miles said, his tone incredibly casual, devoid of any anger or emotion. It was the exact same voice he used when instructing his office clerks. "Eat quickly. My mother called again. She wants us to stop by the family estate this evening to review the guest list for the winter gala. I expect you to be ready by 6, looking presentable." I sat down at the opposite end of the table, the massive distance between us feeling like a physical canyon. I looked at the beautifully prepared food on my plate, but my stomach instantly turned with nausea. I couldn't swallow a single bite. "I will be ready, Miles," I replied, keeping my voice completely flat, mirroring his own cold detachment. I didn't cry. I didn't ask him why. I couldn't let him see what I was thinking. I just needed to look normal until I had somewhere to go. By 5 o'clock, the gray evening sky began to darken, casting a gloomy shadow over the empty mansion. I stood in front of the wardrobe, selecting a formal dark emerald dress. It was elegant but modest, exactly the type of outfit Elara Sterling approved of. As I pinned a simple silver brooch near my collar, my hands were perfectly steady. The trembling from last night was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, protective numbness. I was no longer a grieving bride. I was a woman preparing to enter an enemy territory, shielding my broken heart behind a plastic smile. Exactly at 6, the roar of Miles's car echoed outside. When I walked down the porch, he didn't step out to open the door for me. I climbed into the passenger seat, and the suffocating silence inside the vehicle felt heavier than the winter air outside. He drove with a furious, sharp speed, his eyes locked on the dark road ahead. "Remember, Hazel," Miles spoke suddenly, his voice low and calculating without him even looking at me. "When we are inside my parents' estate, you will act like a happy, newly married woman. Think carefully before you say anything stupid. No one will believe a single word against me, and you will only embarrass your own parents. You don't want to destroy your family's peace over your petty drama, do you?" His psychological manipulation hung in the dark space between us like a sharp knife. He knew my parents loved him, and he knew how much I cared about protecting them from pain. I turned my head toward the passenger window, watching the streetlights blur past into long yellow lines. "Don't worry, Miles," I whispered softly, keeping my true thoughts entirely hidden. "I know exactly how to play my part." The Sterling family estate was massive, a grand stone mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and bright security lights. As Miles parked the car, his entire demeanor changed in an instant. The tense, hateful aura vanished, replaced by that flawless, charming smile he showed to the world. He walked around to my side, opened the door, and gently wrapped his arm around my waist as we walked up the stone steps. To anyone watching, we were the picture of young, wealthy love. But to me, his hand felt like a heavy, suffocating shackle. The front door opened, and Elara greeted us with open arms. "Oh, my beautiful children, come inside, it's freezing out there," she gasped, hugging us tightly. The warmth inside the house was overwhelming. As we sat in the lavish living room surrounded by crystal chandeliers, Elara spread the grand guest list for the winter gala across the mahogany table. Miles sat close to me, his fingers casually playing with mine on the velvet sofa. Every time his skin brushed against mine, A wave of disgust hit my stomach, but I kept my face perfectly calm, nodding and smiling at Eleanor's elaborate seating arrangements. "We must have a special table for your family, Hazel," Eleanor said warmly, her eyes shining with excitement. "And of course, beautiful Stella must sit right at the front. She is such a delight. I was thinking we should invite her to spend a weekend at your mansion next week so she can spend some time with her sister." At the mention of Stella coming to stay, I froze. My heart skipped a beat with pure panic. Miles turned his gaze to me, a silent, intense warning flashing in his eyes. He wanted to see if I would show any jealousy or make a scene in front of his mother. I swallowed the lump of anxiety in my throat, forcing a soft, sweet smile onto my face as I looked back at Eleanor. I could not let Miles see my fear, and I could not let Eleanor suspect anything was wrong. "That is a wonderful idea, Eleanor," I said, my voice steady and gentle. "Stella would love that, and it would be so nice to have some family around." Miles's grip on my hand relaxed slightly, a wave of relief washing over his features before he quickly masked it with a polite nod. He thought he had successfully brainwashed me into submission. He believed his threats about my family had worked perfectly, and that I was too terrified to oppose his wishes. As we drove back in the pitch-black night, the silence inside the car was suffocating. Miles didn't speak a word until we parked inside our dark, empty garage. The moment the engine cut off, he turned around in his seat, looking at me with a cold, triumphant expression. "You made the right choice tonight, Hazel," Miles whispered, his voice dangerously smooth. "You see, as long as you remain a quiet, obedient wife, your family stays perfectly safe. Don't ever forget your place in this house, and we won't have any problems." I unbuckled my seatbelt calmly and met his dark glare with absolute composure. I didn't say a word. I just nodded and stepped out of the car. He thought he had completely broken my spirit, forcing me to accept my fate as an invisible shadow to keep my family safe. But as I walked into the dark mansion, I knew I was just buying time. I needed to be patient, save my resources, and protect Stella, without him ever knowing what I was truly planning. The front door closed with a heavy, hollow thud, leaving me alone in the sweeping silence of the dark foyer. I climbed the stairs to the guest room, my steps slow but intentional. Every word Miles had spoken in the car vibrated in my ears. "No one will believe you. You will only embarrass your parents." The worst part was the absolute truth in his calculation. My parents adored him. They saw him as the perfect, wealthy savior who had elevated our family's social status. If I ran to them now, crying about his secret obsession, they would likely dismiss it as the nerves of a young, insecure bride. I sat on the edge of the bed, refusing to let a single tear fall. Crying was a luxury for those who had a safe place to run, and right now I had none. I needed a strategy, but more than that, I needed time. I needed to build a financial cushion, to look for cracks in Miles's perfect armor, and to keep my head completely clear. My main priority shifted instantly to the upcoming week. Stella was coming to stay under this very roof, completely unaware of the wolves waiting in the shadows. I had to protect her at all costs, which meant Miles could never suspect what was truly going on in my mind. For the next few days, I became the perfect phantom wife. I organized the household chores, smiled politely at the staff, and sat across from Miles at dinner without showing a flicker of resentment. I let him believe his psychological cage had successfully broken my spirit. Let him feel victorious, I thought, watching him smile into his wine glass. The quieter I became, the safer Stella would be when she finally stepped through that door. By Tuesday afternoon, the heavy winter air outside seemed to hold its breath. I stood by the large living room window, watching the iron gates of the estate slowly swing open. A yellow taxi crawled up the long, winding driveway, and my heart instantly tightened in my chest. The door opened, and there she was, Stella. She stepped out onto the gravel, her bright red coat a stark, vibrant contrast against the bleak, gray background of the mansion. She looked up at the massive stone house with wide, innocent eyes full of wonder, completely unaware of the dark reality hidden behind its beautiful walls. I took a deep, steadying breath, pressing my cold palms against my skirt. "Smile, Hazel. You cannot let her see the truth," I reminded myself fiercely. By the time I opened the front door, Stella was already running up the steps. "Hazel," she squealed, throwing her arms around my neck, bringing the fresh, clean scent of the outside world with her. "Oh, it is absolutely beautiful here. You live like a queen." "Welcome, Stella," I whispered, hugging her tightly, holding onto her just a second longer than usual to anchor myself. "It's so wonderful to see you." As the maid took her bags, Miles stepped out from his study. He had left his office early today, a detail that hadn't escaped my notice. The polite, welcoming smile on his face was flawless, but as he walked toward us, I noticed the slight, sharp intensity in his eyes as they locked onto Stella. "Stella, welcome to our home," Miles said, his voice smooth and incredibly charming as he offered a polite nod. "Hazel has been talking about your visit all week. Please make yourself completely at home." I stood beside him, maintaining my perfect mask, keeping my gaze steady. The dangerous game had officially entered my sanctuary, and I had to be more careful than ever. Dinner that evening felt like a beautifully staged play where I was the only person aware of the shifting script. The dining table was covered in fine porcelain and silver, casting sharp reflections under the crystal chandelier. Stella sat across from us, her eyes bright as she shared stories about her college classes and her friends. She was completely at ease, entirely charmed by the luxury surrounding her. Every few minutes, she would look at Miles and express how lucky she felt that her older sister had found such a generous, successful man. "You really have a beautiful eye for detail, Miles," Stella said, gesturing toward the elegant painting hanging on the dining room wall. "Hazel always told me you had great taste." "Thank you, Stella," Miles replied, a smooth, warm smile stretching across his handsome face. He raised his wine glass slightly toward her. "But I believe the true beauty of this house comes from having family here. We want you to feel completely relaxed during your stay." I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, carefully cutting my food. I didn't interrupt, nor did I let my face betray the sudden chill running down my spine. I was watching Miles's hands, his posture, and the subtle, lingering way his gaze rested on my sister whenever she laughed. It wasn't an open attack. It was a slow, quiet observation, the kind of psychological boundary crossing that only I could detect. When dinner ended, Stella stretched her arms and yawned softly. "I think the traveling has finally caught up to me," she admitted with an innocent smile. "Of course," I said quickly, standing up from my chair before Miles could offer. "Let me show you to your room, Stella. You need a good night's rest." The guest room I had prepared for Stella was on the opposite side of the east wing, deliberately far away from the master bedroom. I walked her inside, helping her unpack her sweater and books onto the dark mahogany dresser. The room was warm and beautifully lit, but as I smoothed out the heavy velvet blankets on her bed, a quiet anxiety sat heavy in my chest. "If you need anything at all during the night, Stella, my room is just down the main hall," I said, keeping my voice soft and perfectly natural. "Don't hesitate to come find me." Stella laughed, sitting on the edge of the mattress. "Hazel, stop worrying so much, I'm fine. Miles is wonderful, the house is amazing, and I am going to sleep like a baby." She leaned forward, her eyes softening. "I'm just so happy to see you taken care of." I forced a gentle, reassuring smile and kissed her forehead. "Good night, sweetie." When I stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, closing her door softly behind me, the warmth vanished. The long hallway felt cold and dangerously empty. I walked back toward the main staircase, but as I approached the study, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of golden light spilled onto the dark wooden floorboards. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Through the narrow opening, I could see Miles. He was standing by his desk, completely still, holding the small glass coaster Stella had used during dinner. He wasn't moving, he was just staring down at it with a blank, unreadable intensity. It was the exact look of a man who had just acquired a new, priceless piece for his collection. A cold shiver ran through me, but I didn't make a sound. I silently stepped back into the shadows, keeping my face a perfect, emotionless mask, and walked upstairs to wait out the night. I lay awake for hours in the dark guest bedroom, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the distant, lonely ticking of the hallway clock. The image of Miles in his study, staring blankly at the glass, remained burned into my mind. He wasn't going to make an aggressive, obvious move, that wasn't his style. His cruelty was built on subtle control and psychological games. He wanted to enjoy the quiet thrill of having Stella under his roof, right in front of me, while using his unspoken threats to keep me completely paralyzed. But I am not paralyzed anymore, I thought, my breathing regular and calm in the darkness. I am just watching. The next morning, I arrived in the kitchen before the sun had even fully risen. I took over the breakfast preparation from the head maid, systematically organizing the plates and checking the silver. I needed to keep my hands busy, to ground myself in the mundane reality of running this massive house. When Miles walked into the dining area at his usual time, I was already standing by the coffee machine, looking every bit the quiet, dutiful wife he expected. He looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face for any signs of panic, anger, or the exhaustion of a sleepless night. I gave him nothing. I simply poured his coffee and set it down with a steady, polite hand. "Good morning, Miles," I said, my voice smooth and utterly clear. He paused, his fingers wrapping around the warm porcelain cup. A small, almost imperceptible smirk appeared at the corner of his lips. "Good morning, Hazel. Did you sleep well?" "Excellently," I replied, meeting his gaze with a pleasant, emotionless smile. "I'll go wake Stella now." The morning unfolded with an unsettling, fragile normalcy. Stella bounced into the dining room a few minutes later, her presence bringing a burst of genuine warmth that this cold mansion hadn't felt in months. She talked endlessly about her plans for the day, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible currents passing between Miles and me across the table. Miles was a master of public deception. He asked about her studies with just the right amount of polite, brotherly interest, never lingering too long on any topic, never doing anything that would arouse her innocence. "I have a few late afternoon meetings at the firm, Hazel," Miles remarked casually as he patted his lips with a linen napkin and stood up. "But I should be back in time for dinner. Make sure Stella has everything she needs." "Of course," I replied, my voice steady, my face perfectly serene. "Have a productive day, Miles." He offered a smooth, parting smile to Stella and walked out. The moment the front door clicked shut, the heavy weight in my chest eased just enough for me to take a real breath. But I knew this temporary peace was a mirage. Miles wasn't giving up. He was testing my boundaries, watching to see if his psychological threats about my family would keep me obedient while he played his long, quiet game. I spent the afternoon trailing behind Stella as she explored the estate's winter gardens, laughing at her jokes and taking photos for her. I forced myself to be fully present for her, to wrap her in a protective layer of sisterly love so thick that she wouldn't notice the creeping shadows around us. But every time my gaze drifted back to the dark stone walls of the mansion, a cold truth settled deep within me. I couldn't just hide anymore. I had to start watching his movements, just as closely as he watched mine. By 5 o'clock, the weak winter sun had dropped completely below the horizon, burying the estate in a thick, freezing darkness. The heavy iron gates creaked open, announcing Miles's return right on schedule. As his headlights swept across the frosted windows of the living room, a familiar numbness settled over me. I stood up from the sofa where Stella and I had been reviewing her garden photos, smoothing down my skirt with absolute deliberation. The grace period was officially over. The theater was about to begin again. When Miles entered the foyer, shedding his heavy wool coat, he looked relaxed, almost entirely at peace. He stepped into the warm living room, his eyes scanning the space until they briefly met mine. There was a faint, mocking curiosity in his glance, a silent question asking if I had broken under the strain of the day. I simply offered him a polite, hospitable nod, giving him nothing but the face of a perfect hostess. "The traffic was brutal, but coming home to this makes it worth it," Miles said smoothly, his voice carrying that flawless, warm charm as he smiled at Stella. He walked over to the side table and poured himself a small glass of whiskey. "Did you girls have a pleasant afternoon?" "It was wonderful, Miles," Stella said enthusiastically, leaning forward. "Hazel showed me the entire conservatory. You have an incredible collection of rare winter ferns." "Hazel has always appreciated the finer, quieter things," Miles replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before taking a slow sip. His gaze drifted to me, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. She knows exactly how much care it takes to keep something delicate from completely withering away in a house like this. The underlying threat in his words was quiet, sharp, and meant entirely for me. I felt the hidden edge of his words cut through the quiet room, but my face remained an unreadable, elegant mask. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. Instead, I let a soft, polite smile touch my lips, meeting his dark gaze with a calm composure that seemed to catch him slightly off guard. "You're entirely right, Miles," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly balanced. "Some things require absolute vigilance to protect, but you'd be surprised at how resilient the right roots can be, even in the harshest winter." Stella looked between us, completely missing the psychological chess match unfolding in front of her. She simply laughed, thinking we were having a poetic conversation about gardening. "Well, whatever you two are doing, it's working. The house feels like a hidden sanctuary." "A sanctuary," Miles repeated softly, the smirk returning to his face as he set his empty glass down on the mahogany table with a sharp, distinct click. "Yes, let's call it that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to wash up before dinner. I asked the chef to prepare something special for tonight." As he walked past my chair, the faint scent of his expensive cologne and the cold air of the outside world touched my shoulder. He didn't touch me, but his physical presence felt like a silent warning. He was showing me that he could weave his threats into ordinary conversation right in front of my sister, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But as I watched his retreating figure disappear up the grand staircase, I realized something vital. He was getting confident. He truly believed his psychological cage had paralyzed me, and in this quiet house of secrets, his confidence was going to be my greatest advantage. Dinner that night was served with an eerie, calculated precision. The chef had prepared a rich, elaborate sea bass dish, and the heavy aroma of garlic and white wine butter filled the formal dining room. Miles sat at the head of the table, commanding the space with his quiet, effortless authority. He was incredibly attentive to Stella, ensuring her glass was always filled with fresh juice and asking thoughtful questions about her career aspirations. He looked like the ultimate benefactor, a man dedicated to the happiness of his wife's family. "I was thinking," Miles began casually, slicing his fish with a steady, rhythmic motion. "Since you have an interest in historical architecture, I could arrange a private tour of the downtown library's archive wing next Thursday. The director is a close personal client of mine." Stella's eyes lit up with instant excitement. "Oh, Miles, really? That wing is completely closed to the public. That would be incredible." A cold, sharp alarm went off in the back of my mind. Next Thursday was after Stella's scheduled visit was supposed to end. He was smoothly trying to extend her stay, creating reasons to keep her inside his orbit, using his immense privilege and influence as bait. He wanted to see if I would lose my composure and break my quiet mask to protest. I carefully set my fork down, ensuring it didn't make a single sound against the porcelain. I looked directly at Miles, my eyes calm, my breathing entirely regular. "That is very generous of you, Miles," I said, my voice sweet and untroubled. "But Stella has her midterm exams starting next Friday. She needs to be back on campus to study. We wouldn't want to distract her from her goals, would we?" The air in the dining room instantly grew heavy. For a split second, the charming, generous brother-in-law mask slipped from Miles's face, revealing the cold, dangerous calculation hidden underneath. His grip on his silver knife tightened just enough for his knuckles to turn white. He hadn't expected me to counter his move so smoothly, using Stella's own education as a flawless shield that he couldn't easily tear down without looking unreasonable. "Oh, right," Stella said, her excitement fading into a disappointed but understanding nod. "I completely forgot about the history midterms. Hazel is right, Miles. I have to be back in the library all weekend. I can't afford to fail." Miles quickly recovered, his smooth, effortless smile returning as if nothing had happened. He relaxed his posture and took a slow sip of his water. "Of course. Education always comes first," he said, his voice completely calm, though his eyes remained locked on mine with a sharp, icy intensity. "Hazel always remembers the finest details, don't you, darling? It's a very admirable trait." I try my best, Miles, I replied, meeting his gaze without a single tremor of fear. The rest of the dinner passed in polite conversation, but the victory felt small compared to the looming reality. I had successfully blocked him this time, but I had also shown him that I wasn't completely broken. I had drawn a silent line in the sand to protect my sister. As we finally stood up to leave the table, Miles caught my eye one last time before heading toward his study. It was a look that promised the quiet psychological game between us had just escalated to a completely different level. By Wednesday evening, the cold tension inside the mansion had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. I spent the hours systematically preparing for Stella's departure the following morning, ensuring her bags were neatly packed and her return train ticket was placed safely in her coat pocket. I didn't want any last-minute delays or unexpected excuses that Miles could exploit to prolong her stay. I remained completely focused on one clear goal: getting my sister safely out of this house and back to her university campus. Miles spent most of the night locked away in his study, the faint, golden light under his door serving as the only sign of his presence. He didn't try to corner me, nor did he make another attempt to charm Stella during our light dinner. This calculated silence didn't bring me peace. Instead, it made me even more alert. A man like Miles didn't simply accept a setback, he merely retreated to reevaluate his strategy. When the morning finally arrived, a thick gray fog had rolled in over the estate, blurring the sharp lines of the iron gates. I stood in the foyer, holding a warm travel mug of tea for Stella as she buttoned up her red coat. "I can't believe my visit is already over," Stella sighed, wrapping her arms around me for a warm, grateful hug. "Thank you for everything, Hazel. And tell Miles thank you again for being so incredibly welcoming." "I will, sweetie," I whispered, holding her tight, a profound wave of relief washing over me as I heard the taxi's horn honk outside. "Just focus entirely on your exams now. Call me the moment you arrive." I stood on the stone steps of the porch, watching the yellow taxi disappear down the long driveway until its tail lights were swallowed by the thick morning fog. The heavy iron gates closed behind it with a sharp, echoing metallic click. The relief that washed over me was so intense that my knees felt weak for a brief second. Stella was gone. She was safe, returning to her world of books and regular campus life, completely untouched by the darkness of this place. "You must be very proud of yourself," a smooth, low voice remarked from right behind me. I didn't startle. I slowly turned around to find Miles standing in the open doorway. He hadn't bothered to put on a coat against the freezing morning air. He was holding his half-empty coffee mug, looking at me with a calm, amused expression that felt colder than the winter wind. "I am simply glad she had a peaceful visit, Miles," I replied, my voice steady, my face maintaining its clean, emotionless composure as I stepped past him into the warmth of the foyer. He closed the heavy oak door and followed me, his footsteps completely silent on the marble floor. "You played your hand beautifully, Hazel, using her exams, playing the protective older sister. It was a very clever move." He paused, setting his mug down on the console table. "But she is gone now. The curtain has fallen on your little performance, and we are right back where we started." I stopped and looked directly into his dark eyes, refusing to show even a flicker of fear. The dynamic had changed. I had proven to him that I could fight back without making a sound. "No, Miles," I said softly. "We aren't back where we started, because now I know exactly how you play." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the grand foyer. For the first time since I had entered this marriage, I saw something different flicker behind Miles's dark, controlled eyes. It wasn't anger. It was the sharp, dangerous curiosity of a hunter who had just realized his prey was no longer running. His smooth smile slowly faded, replaced by a straight, cold line. He took a slow step closer, his physical presence designed to intimidate, but I remained completely still, anchoring my heels into the polished marble floor. "Is that so?" Miles murmured, his voice dropping to a low, quiet whisper that vibrated through the empty space. "You think you understand the game just because you managed to block a single move, Hazel. That isn't knowledge. That is just temporary luck." "It's more than luck, Miles," I countered softly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the household budget rather than our broken reality. Luck is chaotic. You are completely predictable. You rely entirely on isolation and the fear of what others will think. But once those things stop working on someone, your power simply evaporates. He stared at me for a long, quiet moment, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to find a new psychological vulnerability to exploit, a way to rebuild the walls of my cage. We will see how long that confidence lasts when the monthly bills arrive, and when your family asks for their next financial favor, he said coldly, turning on his heel. As he walked down the corridor toward his study, I took a deep, quiet breath. He was resorting to financial threats now, the classic, desperate move of a man losing his absolute control. The heavy click of his study door echoed through the hallway, leaving me alone with his parting threat. I stood in the center of the foyer, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. In the past, his mention of my family's financial dependence would have left me completely cold with panic. But today, it felt like a hollow echo. By exposing his ultimate leverage so openly, Miles had unintentionally handed me the exact map I needed to escape his control. He thought his wealth was an unbreakable chain, but it was merely a math problem that needed solving. I walked up the grand staircase and entered the small sitting room adjacent to our bedroom. I locked the door quietly behind me, sat down at the writing desk, and pulled out a clean, blank notebook from the bottom drawer. It was time to build my own foundation, block by block, away from his prying eyes. I began by listing every asset and small account I held in my own name before the marriage, minor inheritance pieces, old bank details, and the small savings I had left untouched. Next, I opened my laptop, systematically searching for independent digital archiving and remote research consultation work that matched my university background. I didn't need a massive fortune overnight. I simply needed a steady, invisible stream of independent income that he couldn't touch or track. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the room was the quiet, rhythmic tapping of my keyboard and the soft scratch of my pen against the paper. I was no longer just a passive observer waiting for his next psychological strike. I was actively building my own sanctuary, constructing a financial cushion that would eventually render his threats entirely useless. The cage was still there, but I had finally started filing away at the bars. By the time dusk began to settle over the estate, I had successfully established 2 secure, password-protected freelance profiles and finalized my initial project drafts. My hands were perfectly steady as I closed my laptop and slipped the handwritten notebook back into its hidden drawer. For the first time in months, the heavy, ambient dread of this mansion didn't weigh me down. I had a plan, and more importantly, I had a purpose that extended far beyond surviving Miles's psychological mood swings. When I descended the stairs for dinner, I noticed the atmosphere in the house had subtly shifted again. The maids moved with a quiet, hurried nervousness, and the overhead lights seemed dimmed to a sharp, clinical glow. Miles was already seated at the dining table, but he wasn't reading his usual financial papers or checking his phone. He was simply sitting there, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, watching the doorway. "You spent a remarkable amount of time in the upper sitting room today, Hazel," he remarked casually as I pulled out my chair. His tone was smooth, but his eyes were bright with a calculating alertness. "The staff mentioned you skipped your afternoon tea entirely." I was merely catching up on some personal correspondence and organizing my old university notes, Miles, I replied, keeping my voice sweet, conversational, and entirely unbothered. I reached for the salad tongs with a fluid, relaxed grace. It's important to keep the mind sharp during these long winter months. He tilted his head slightly, trying to read the absolute calm on my face, looking for any fracture in my composure. "Indeed," he murmured softly. "A sharp mind can be a very dangerous thing when it starts wandering outside its boundaries." I kept my hand firmly on the salad tongs, using the minor physical weight to anchor myself as his eyes locked onto me. "Boundaries are often self-imposed, Miles," I murmured, carefully focusing on the texture of the food rather than looking at him. "Sometimes, exploring what lies beyond them is the only way to realize what you are truly capable of." For a second, Miles didn't look angry. Instead, a soft, almost appreciative smile touched his lips. He slowly leaned back in his chair, picking up his wine glass and swirling the dark crimson liquid. The calculated coldness was gone, replaced by the curious, intense gaze of a mentor watching a student finally learn a difficult lesson. It was far more unsettling than his usual threats. The submissive girl he had married was changing, and he was observing the shift with a strange, quiet fascination. The rest of the meal passed in a dense, heavy quiet. Neither of us spoke, yet the silence itself felt like an ongoing conversation. Every click of silverware against the porcelain felt louder than it should. When dinner finally ended, Miles stood up, pausing just beside my chair. He reached out and gently, almost warmly, adjusted the collar of my sweater. "I have to look over some late-night legal briefs in my study," he said, his voice dropping to a low, surprisingly soft tone near my ear. "Don't ruin your sleep over the house chores, Hazel. Get some proper rest." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, a genuine chill ran down my spine. His sudden warmth didn't feel like peace. It felt like a trap I hadn't seen coming. Once inside my room, I didn't turn on the main lights. I worked by the dim, golden glow of a small desk lamp, keeping my movements as minimal as possible to avoid making noise. I opened my laptop and logged into my secure dashboard. To my relief, my first research draft had been accepted by an independent academic archive, and a modest payment was already clearing into my private account. Seeing that small number grow felt like watching the first crack appear in the stone walls of my prison. Suddenly, the soft handle of my bedroom door gave a tiny, almost imperceptible click. My breath caught in my throat, and for a terrifying second, my fingers froze over the keyboard. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to lower the laptop screen just enough to hide the glowing dashboard, leaving only a standard PDF of old university lecture notes visible. The door pushed open slowly, and Miles stood in the frame. He had shed his tie, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, but his posture was completely alert. He held a glass of water in his hand, looking surprisingly tired, almost vulnerable. "I saw the light under your door," he said softly, his eyes scanning the room before settling on my desk. "I thought you would be asleep by now. You've been pushing yourself too hard lately." "I was just reviewing some old literature essays," I replied, my throat dry as I forced a polite smile. I reached out for the water, my fingers brushing against his cold skin. "Sometimes, reading the classics helps clear my mind when the house gets too quiet. Thank you for the water, Miles." Miles didn't move from the bedside immediately. He stood there for a few long, agonizing seconds, his eyes lingering on the silver edge of my laptop. He was a corporate lawyer. He was trained to spot anomalies, to read the tiny micro-expressions of hesitation on a witness's face. I tried to slow my racing pulse, terrified he would hear the frantic beating of my heart in the quiet room. "Literature," he repeated softly, stepping closer to the desk and placing his hand gently on my shoulder. The unexpected gesture made my skin crawl, yet his touch wasn't aggressive. It felt genuinely protective. "I didn't realize your old university essays still held such a deep fascination for you, Hazel. You used to tell me how much you hated this specific professor's syllabus." The comment caught me completely off guard. A cold sweat broke out across my collarbone, he remembered. He was testing me, wrapping his trap in a soft, casual memory. "I hated it then," I said, swallowing hard and forcing my gaze to meet his. "But time changes your perspective on a lot of things, Miles, don't you think?" He tilted his head, his sharp eyes searching mine, looking for the lie buried beneath the sentiment. He let his hand slide off my shoulder, apparently satisfied with my response, or perhaps choosing to play a longer game. "Well, don't ruin your eyes in the dim light," he murmured, his tone returning to that gentle, patronizing warmth. "We wouldn't want you getting exhausted." He finally turned and walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. I let out a jagged, trembling breath, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the desk. The sound of his bedroom door closing in the distance was my cue to move. I didn't open the laptop immediately. Instead, I sat completely frozen in the dark for 5 full minutes, listening to the ambient creaks of the old mansion. The realization settled heavily in my chest. My bedroom was no longer a safe haven. Miles was watching, and his sudden performance of a caring husband was a warning shot. I carefully picked up the handwritten notebook from my drawer. Writing my plans down on physical paper was a liability now. If he decided to search my room while I was downstairs, a hidden notebook would be the first thing his efficient hands would find. With absolute deliberation, I walked over to the small fireplace in the corner of the room. I struck a single match, the tiny flame cutting through the shadows, and held the corner of the paper to the fire. I watched the neat lines of my bank details and asset lists turn into black, delicate ash, feeding them into the embers one by one. My map to freedom could no longer exist in the physical world. I had to commit every number, every strategy, and every password entirely to memory. When the last scrap of paper vanished, I returned to my desk, opened the laptop, and quickly transferred my cleared freelance earnings into a completely separate, unlinked digital wallet. As I finally shut down the computer and stared out at the foggy winter night, the trembling in my hands stopped. Miles wanted a chess match in the dark, and he was using kindness as a weapon. But he had just forced me to become completely invisible. The next morning, the fog had completely cleared, leaving behind a crisp, blindingly bright winter sunshine. I woke up early, dressed in a tailored, elegant cream sweater, and spent extra care styling my hair. There was no trace of the panic that had gripped me in the dark. If Miles wanted to observe me, I was going to give him a flawless display of absolute peace. When I entered the sunlit breakfast room, Miles was already there, sipping his black coffee. He looked up, his sharp eyes instantly assessing my appearance, searching for the dark circles or anxious posture he clearly expected to see. "Good morning, Miles," I said brightly, pouring myself a cup of green tea. "Good morning, Hazel," he replied, his tone cautious, his brow twitching just a fraction at my calm energy. He set his coffee cup down. "You seem exceptionally well rested after your late-night reading session." "I am," I smiled, sitting across from him. The literature really did help. In fact, it made me realize how much I've missed having a structured routine. I think I'm going to start spending my afternoons volunteering at the local Historical Society's digital library archive next week. It was a brilliant countermove. By announcing an official, public reason to be out of the house and on a computer, I was creating a perfect cover for my freelance work. Miles's eyes narrowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He was trapped by his own public persona. He couldn't forbid his wife from doing high society charity work without looking like a tyrant in front of the community. The library archives were freezing on Tuesday afternoon, the air smelling heavily of old paper and dust. I sat at a secluded corner desk near the back, completely absorbed in the quiet hum of the room, my fingers moving steadily across my laptop keyboard as I wrapped up a second research project. The peaceful isolation was exactly what I needed. Suddenly, the calm shattered when my phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was a text from an unknown number, but the message itself made my blood run instantly cold. It contained a single screenshot. It was a digital log from our mansion's primary router network from last night, showing a high volume of data traffic directed towards an independent freelance server at 2:00 a.m., originating from my specific device ID. Below the image, another text popped up, this time from Miles's personal number. "You left the mansion's automated security network logs open on my study desk last week, Hazel. I noticed some very unusual background traffic from your laptop last night. I'm actually driving past the Historical Society right now. The weather is turning bad, so I've decided to come inside and pick you up early. Let's discuss your literature research on the way home. See you in 5 minutes." My hands began to shake violently as I stared at the screen, looking toward the heavy entrance doors of the archive. He hadn't broken my passwords. He had simply monitored his own house, and now, he was standing right outside.